making up almost 60% of the calorie intake for Americans and almost 40% of the calorie intake for Australians. And not only that, but a third of the baby foods in the UK are made up of these. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about ultra-processed foods. In today's episode of Dr. Nora, I take you through what ultra-processed foods are and what impact they can have on your health. Now, you may have heard of ultra-processed foods because it's been making the rounds in the news recently, and it's because of a few studies that have been released recently which have shown that consuming ultra-processed foods actually has quite a negative impact on our health. In fact, those people who consume ultra-processed foods on a regular basis actually have a slightly increased risk of chronic diseases. In fact, one study has shown that those people who consumed ultra-processed foods regularly throughout their day-to-day life had an increased risk of colorectal cancer, which is actually the second leading cancer cause of death worldwide. That is pretty scary stuff. And what's even more scarier is how much we are consuming of ultra-processed foods in our day-to-day lives. As I mentioned before, almost 60% of the calorie intake for Americans is made up of ultra-processed foods. In Australia, we're slightly better. It's about 40% of our calorie intake. But what's more alarming than that is that almost a third of the baby food that's present in the UK is actually ultra-processed. That is pretty shocking to think that our little babies, we're feeding them with these ultra-processed foods. But perhaps you're saying, well, what are ultra-processed foods and how can I avoid them? Well, ultra-processed foods are foods that are made up of 5 or more ingredients. Now, there is a classification that looks at foods, and this is coined by some Brazilian researchers that came up with the NOVA classification for food. Now, the first group is minimally processed or unprocessed foods. Now, this includes things such as milk, eggs, fruit, veggies, and your pulses, because these are foods that haven't been processed or they've been minimally altered in some way. The second group is processed ingredients. Now, these are foods that can be added into Group 1 foods, for example. That means salt and sugar, in which case you can add those into your Group 1 foods, such as your eggs, having salty eggs, for example. The third group is processed foods. Now, these, generally speaking, are foods that are added by a combination of Group 1 and 2, for example, jams and pickles, but usually they're done on a homemade level. So that means you don't add in artificial sweeteners or preservatives or emulsifiers in this particular group. The fourth group is your ultra-processed food group. Now, these are foods that have got 5 or more ingredients within them. And generally speaking, they can't be made on a homemade level. Now, these are foods that contain lots of emulsifiers, preservatives, added sugars, artificial sweeteners, and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, these foods tend to have a longer shelf life. So when you're in the supermarket and you see that ready meal and you take a look at the back and you'll see that there's at least over 5 ingredients, then you know that is classed as an ultra-processed food. So what are some common examples of ultra-processed foods? Well, as I said, ready meals are one of the commonest ways of getting some ultra-processed foods in your diet. Secondly, mass-made bread. So if you make home bread, fantastic, good for you, you know what the ingredients are. And generally speaking, there tends to be less ingredients in homemade bread. But if you're buying it from the supermarket, they can be 5 or more ingredients. Foods like sausages that may be processed, they also contain lots of ingredients to them, and these are also classed as ultra-processed foods. And of course, other foods such as your McDonald's or your hamburgers are also classified as ultra-processed foods. Okay, so you may be thinking, well, Dr. Nora, ultra-processed foods, well, there are some foods out there that are marketed as being really healthy or vegan or organic. Surely they can't be ultra-processed as well. Well, actually, they are still classified as ultra-processed foods. So even if the label says vegan or super-duper healthy, super-duper nutritious, super-duper organic, the easiest way to have a look to see if something is ultra-processed is to flip it on the back and take a look at the nutritional label. If that ingredient or if that product has got 5 or more ingredients, then you're dealing with an ultra-processed food, regardless of the origin of the food, whether it's organic or not. But in saying that, it is important to note that some ultra-processed foods have got a higher nutritional value than others. Say, for example, whole grain breads. They may have a higher nutritional value than, say, white bread. And so even though they're still ultra-processed food, one has a higher nutritional value than the other. So it's always really recommended to select your food wisely and always read the back of the label. So now that we know what ultra-processed foods are and what the impact they can have potentially on our health, we now need to think about what we can do to avoid them and to keep ourselves nice and healthy. My first piece of advice to you guys out there when you're going shopping is to check the nutritional label. If you happen to pick up a packet of ready-made lasagna and you look on the back of the nutritional label and you can see some words on there that you wouldn't understand or you wouldn't have in your own pantry or your kitchen, safe to say that probably contains a lot of extra added salt and fat and saturated fats and preservatives and emulsifiers and agents that will keep that product on for a long shelf life. You can probably safely assume that that is going to be an ultra-processed food. And needless to say, it's probably worthwhile parking that one to the side and looking for a healthier alternative that has, say, less ingredients and is a bit more nutritiously beneficial for you. Be sure to always have a healthy and balanced diet. Aim for 30 to 40% carbohydrates with some vegetables mixed in, and around 30 to 40% protein. Limit your fat to under 35%. This could include treats and also vegetable oil. And always make sure that you drink plenty of water and avoid any sweetened beverages such as orange juice. My second tip for you guys is to go back to basics. We live in a very convenient, fast world. Everything is ready-made. There's a lot of food out there that you can pick up at a fraction of the price. It's so convenient. Pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes and hey presto, you got yourself a nice meal. However, is it that nice? So if you guys do have time, maybe spend some time meal prepping on the weekend or in the evenings and go back to scratch. Only use ingredients that your grandmother would have had, for example. Only use ingredients that don't sound like a science experiment. Use things that sound fresh and healthy and nutritious, and you're bound to get more nutritious benefit from them than, say, those products that do contain a chemical equation within them. My final tip for you guys is to be mindful of your family's food choices. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, ultra-processed foods are also seen in baby foods and children's foods, as well as adult foods as well. So when you are going shopping and you do think, oh, that looks really convenient, have a think about what it is that you're feeding your family and what impact it can have on their future. And certainly, hopefully, with this advice, you'll be able to lead a happy and healthy life. I would love to hear from you guys what foods you're having on your dinner plate tonight, and whether they're ultra-processed foods or whether you've made them from scratch. Please let me know in the comment section below. And of course, I hope you guys have found this video useful, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care and stay healthy.